How to avoid the crowds on Camino? What are the strategies to avoid the crowds, Rob? That was a question from Gregory. Thank you very much for the question, and it's one that a lot of people are concerned about at the moment, I think. So I'll answer that coming right up. So Gregory, thank you very much for your question, and thank you everybody for all the questions that are coming in. Do keep them coming in. I really want to make sure that the videos on this channel are providing you with the information that you really want, not just what I want to share, because the overall point of this channel, if you weren't across it, is that particularly for first-time pilgrims, I really want to make sure that you're comfortable with setting out on the Camino and that you're going to have a great time. So it's about encouraging people to get out there and maybe to equip them with a little bit of information that will help them get the most enjoyment out of it without going over the top. You know, walking a Camino is not hard. You turn up with some gear and you start walking. But people naturally have questions in their mind, so I'm happy to help. So anyway, crowd avoidance strategies. I've joined a couple of Facebook groups recently, and I've been on EVA's forum for quite a while, and a lot of talk this year is about you know, the bed race and not being able to find accommodation and all the rest of it. I'll do a separate video on accommodation, but I'll touch on elements of that at the end of this one, because I'm not convinced the situation's quite as bad as people make out, and I'll explain why. If you've had the experience of not being able to find a bed, I'm not saying that you did something wrong, but I'm not sure the problem is as big as people make out. Okay, so crowd avoidance strategies. There's a few very simple things, Gregory. I saw a few posts on Facebook recently where somebody was complaining about how crowded it was from Sarria to Santiago, and they were something like they were on their 4th or 5th Camino, and it was like, don't you know the Camino Frances is the most busy route? Don't you know this is the most busy time of year? Hello? You know, so my first bit of advice is think about the route. The Camino Frances is the most popular route for a reason. It's kind of considered, you know, the original route. It's got the most infrastructure, you know, in terms of facility, accommodation and places to eat and, you know, luggage transfer and tours and all that sort of stuff. So guess what? It's like moths to the flame. It attracts everybody, and it's getting busier and busier. And you know, they're breaking all records this year. In a way, that's sad because it is, to my mind, probably one of the best Camino routes. It's got a special feeling about it, a special energy, and I've talked about that in a couple of other videos. There's really no other route quite like it. But we're probably victims, or, you know, we're probably part of the problem ourselves. You know, so many of us enjoy the Camino so much, and we all go back and we all walk the Camino Frances again. So we actually create the problem that we don't like. You know, we are it. What's that saying? We have met the enemy, and it is us. You know, we are the crowds. So there's a degree of that. You know, be careful on picking the route. Now, if it's your very first Camino and you want to walk the Camino Frances, you know, well, I don't really want to walk another one. There are other great routes. Another favourite for a start is the Portuguese. I haven't walked that, but people love it. And there's a couple of really good options on that one. There are shorter Caminos, the Ingles. You can, you know, I mean, I read somewhere there's 281 Camino routes. That's like all over Europe. There's probably 14 or 15 major ones coming into Santiago. So there's a few to pick from there. You know, you don't have to walk the whole route either, you know, whatever a whole route is. I mean, let's remember that traditionally people started walking from their homes. You know, no one said it started in Saint-Jean or it started in wherever the Norte starts. You know, so when you're deciding on walking a Camino and you're deciding how long you've got, 2-3 weeks, and you're working out, well, okay, we could walk 400 Ks, you know, you can walk the last 400 Ks of any of the routes. So my first bit of advice would be, don't be so hung up on the Camino Frances. The other routes are really good too. but the Frances is special. Yeah, I don't know. It's a tricky one. So if you're really determined to walk the Camino Frances, have a look at some of the statistics on the Pilgrims Office website. So if you just Google Pilgrims Office Santiago, you'll go to the website there. You can pick 3 or 4 different languages. You can look at the stats. You can start to get a sense of when the busy periods are. And it's always traditionally been May and September. Now I think August is getting quite busy as well. What does that tell you? If you walk outside of those months, it's not going to be quite as busy. Some people love walking it in winter. I'm Australian. I'm not sure I could really cope with that. But look at different times of the year. Absolutely. You know, look at when school holidays are in Europe and in Spain particularly. Look at when the public holidays are. So last year, when I did my long walk from Sevilla along the Via de la Plata, one of the key things I looked for was when is Semana Santa, which is the huge celebration around Easter, because everywhere was going to be packed. And I wanted to make sure I was clear of Seville a week before Semana Santa, and that worked great. So, you know, Seville wasn't too mobbed. I was a week up the path by the time Semana Santa hit, and I got to experience Semana Santa in some of the smaller towns and villages, which was wonderful. But I didn't want to get caught up in that, you know, that holiday wave. So look at things like holidays and all the rest of it. You know, I can quite understand you don't really want to walk in the middle of winter, but look at the shoulder periods and the off-peak periods would be another one. Once you're on Camino, what are some of the things that you can do to avoid the crowds? And you may have heard of these, but I should have brought a guidebook up here. But if you open up any of the guidebooks, particularly, you know, the popular ones like John Brealey's guidebooks, poor fella, passed away, but his daughter's continuing with those. I love John Brealey's guidebooks, but they are clearly laid out in stages. If you're going to write a guidebook, you can't just have this like a roll of toilet paper, you know, a continual one-page book, can you? You've got to break it down into sections. And so most guidebook writers break it down into what they deem to be a reasonable distance to walk in a day. Of course, what happens, everybody looks at these guidebooks and they all walk from Saint-Jean to Roncesvalles, from Roncesvalles to Zubiri, from Zubiri to Pamplona, from Pamplona to Puente Lorena. You know, and what happens? You know, out of Saint-Jean, the last time I walked, I think 350 pilgrims departed that day. It's probably 500 a day at the moment. You've got 500 pilgrims hitting each of those villages, towns at the end of the stage, purely because they're following the guidebooks. Don't follow the guidebooks. I mean, that's one reason not to be too led by the guidebooks. They're guidebooks, they're not rule books. The other reason not to be sort of too influenced by the maps and the way the stages are broken up is that the distances might not suit you. So, for example, the last time I walked the Frances with my wife Pat, we ease into our Caminos. We're not really bothered about, you know, what distances other people are walking. We build up slowly. And so, for example, on day one, we walked to Orizon and then got the Express Buricot back. Next day, Express Buricot back to Orizon, we walked to Roncesvalles. Next day after that, we did Roncesvalles to Bicicleta. Next day, Bicicleta to Zubiri. And in fact, just past it, Acreta. And then next day, Acreta to Pamplona. Pamplona to Uterga. Uterga via Unate to Puente Lorena. You know, we probably did those first few sections in taking twice as long as other people. But, you know, we're walking at our pace. We're staying at intermediate places a lot of the time. So be very careful where you're deciding to finish your days. And don't pick the really popular spots, particularly if there's not much accommodation there. I'm just trying to think, do many people stop? It's a while since I walked the Frances, but from Belorado you go to Via Franca Montes de Oca, you then go up over the hills, and then you come to that place on the way to Burgos before, I can't remember the name of it. But there's like 2 albergues there, and lots of people are heading there, to stay there. So you might consider walking on a bit to to the next village. Where did I go to? I walked on to Atapuerca, a bit further. There's places to stay there. So avoid the sort of stage end points. Not that they are a thing, but it's just, most guidebooks finish at key towns along the way each day. Avoid those. The other thing that you can do to avoid people during your Camino, we're talking about avoiding crowds here, we're not necessarily talking about avoiding people, is be very careful about the time of day that you walk. So let me put that in perspective. On my first couple of Caminos, I was not an early starter at all. I'd have breakfast at 8, I'd be out the door by 9. What allowed me to do that was that I was always in the habit of booking the next day ahead. I'm not one of these people who wants to book weeks or indeed the whole Camino ahead. I'll generally book a day ahead because I'm a slow walker, and I just want to know that I've got a bed at the end of the day, although I didn't always do that on my last Camino. But I would know that I've got a bed or a room or whatever. There was no rush. I'd start off late morning, and funnily enough, I very often didn't see a lot of other people. Why? Because they're all dashing off early in the morning, participating in the bed race. So, that can be a way of avoiding people on the path. I was going to say the other way to do it is to leave really early, but then you just, you're really buying into that whole bed race thing. I prefer to leave a little bit later. I mean, Pat and I on that 2018 Camino, our last day coming into Santiago, we hardly saw anybody because I think we had a leisurely breakfast and, we weren't racing to get to the midday mass. We were going to go to the 6 o'clock one. Weren't many people at all on the path. So pick the time of day that you're actually walking. What other tips are there to avoid the crowds? I think that's probably it. I didn't want to get into accommodation too much, but I'll kind of give you a couple of thoughts and I'll go into them in more detail on another video, because I think part of your question there was really about the availability of beds and so on as well, Gregory. So all of this talk online at the moment about, we can't get a bed, we can't get a bed. There's a couple of things to bear in mind with that. There are just as many reports on Facebook groups and things of people saying we haven't had a problem. Now, why do we get these two very different views? I think a lot of the issue with people saying we can't get a bed is that we can't get a bed of the type that we want in exactly the place that we want. So, for example, I mentioned after Pamplona we've stayed in Uterga. There's 2 or 3 places in Uterga. When I'm with Pat, we generally get a private room, private bathroom. It would be tempting to say if I couldn't get a private room with a bathroom in Uterga, there's a problem with getting beds because I can't get, what we want, and because Pat's not really into staying in albergos. There's probably plenty of beds in Uterga if you try an albergue or some other type of accommodation, or I've stayed in another village a bit further on. I forget the name of it. Go to the next village. Maybe in the accommodation, just get someone to ask. Ring forward to the next village. Is there some accommodation there? So I think a lot of the panic, and I'm not trying to be unkind here, but I think there is a degree of panic. A lot of that is because of fear that there isn't going to be a bed, and therefore then people try to book, and then it's a self-perpetuating philosophy because everybody's trying to book. All of the bookable beds get booked out. So, for example, I relied a lot on Booking.com on my first Camino because I wasn't that confident in making bookings via email or WhatsApp or phone. That's what I do now. What you have to understand is that not a very large proportion of the available beds are actually on Booking.com. So if I'm running let's say I'm running a hostel with 10 private rooms, I probably only put 2 or 3 of them on Booking.com because I have to pay a commission to Booking.com, and I'd rather sell them direct to the Pilgrims and at least make a bit of money on it, Maybe I'm only breaking even when I'm doing it through booking.com. So when you go on booking.com, there's no availability because those 3 have gone. But if you contact that place directly, you probably find there are rooms, there are beds. But that takes, you know, a little bit more sort of logistics nous. I think I've got a video about how to book accommodation. If not, I'll do one. It's really not that hard. I discovered WhatsApp on my last Camino, and it's brilliant. If you use, I'll do a video stepping through the whole process. You basically jump onto an app like Gronza. I love Gronza. I'll use Oturga as the example. I want to stay in Oturga tomorrow night. So generally what I'm doing is I'm getting in somewhere, relaxing, doing my washing, whatever. I'm deciding where I'm going to stay tomorrow night. Let's say it's Oturga. I jump onto Gronza, pick somewhere in Oturga. I'll click on the communication thing. I'll look for their cell phone number. I'll have a prepared message on WhatsApp which says, you know, hi, I'm a pilgrim walking the Camino. Do you have, you know, whatever sort of, do you have a room available for tomorrow night? You know, it's pre-prepared. All I've got to do is change the date, and I send that on WhatsApp. And generally within 30 minutes, I've got a reply. I also use Google Translate because my Spanish isn't that great. So I have my little phrase translated, and then the reply comes in, and either I'll know what that means, or I throw that into Google Translate, and it'll very often say something like, do you want a private bathroom? Or, you know, did you want a double bed or 2 singles? And that kind of stuff. And it's done. It's just a couple of minutes. So it really is quite easy. The other thing about booking accommodation, and again, it all comes down to your preferences on accommodation types. But if you're happy to stay in albergues, and I keep digressing, my apologies, but on my last Camino, I had never really used a communal accommodation in albergues, and I tell you, I felt like a bit of a fraud running this channel when I really couldn't sort of give advice on albergues. So I said, it's time to, you know, jump in and really embrace the albergue experience. So I think I stayed in 20 or 25 last year, and they were great, really good. So I'll do a whole video on albergues and how to book them and etiquettes and so on. But the trick with albergues is that a lot of albergues, you can't book the beds. So guess what? When people are saying, we can't get a bed, we can't book a bed, the albergues that have beds that are non-bookable have beds because people can't book them. So to go back to my last Camino, I mentioned I spent 3 days on the Camino Frances, bridging between the Via de la Plata and the Camino Invierno. It was mobbed. This was in the middle of May, and I've never seen so many pilgrims. I stayed at the Donativo, the Confraternity of St James, Donativo and Rabanal. It was quite busy, but I think there was at least 10 beds still by the end of the night. I stayed in that big albergue at the end of town in El Acebo. Loads of room there. You know, it really wasn't a problem. So do consider, you know, just keep that in the back of your mind. If it's looking like it's difficult to book accommodation, call, email, use WhatsApp. You know, rock up at a Donativo or a municipal albergue that doesn't allow bookings, and you may well find a bed. And look, at the end of the day, what's the worst that can happen? And it's never happened to me, and I don't know anyone that it's ever happened to. But what is the worst that could happen? You could, again, using my example, you could turn up in Oturga and not be able to get a bed. What are you going to do? Call a taxi, go to the next village. Call a taxi and go to Punta Lorena, which is, what, 10 k's down the road, you know. So in your budgeting, have another 20 euros emergency fund for that occasion. It's almost like insurance, where if I can't get a bed, I know I can get a taxi to somewhere. So I'm not, if you think I'm being unkind, please do comment down below, but I'm just not totally convinced that the accommodation issue is quite as bad as people say, though I do understand the numbers are up considerably. I still think there are strategies that you can use to keep away from those crowds, but I'm perfectly happy to be told I'm wrong. Okay, so thank you, Gregory, for that question. Really great question. Thank you, everybody, for all your questions coming in. Do keep them coming in, and I look forward to sharing some thoughts on them coming, in the future days and weeks. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.